Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get going. I think we'll have a few more people joining us, but want to save as much time for discussion as possible. My name is Andrew Wilder, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the U.S. Institute of Peace. I'm the Vice President of the newly created Center for South and Central Asia at USIP. I'm very pleased to announce that we finally escaped the AFPAC architecture here at USIP. I hope we're a bit ahead of the curve of some other interagency colleagues. I think some of us working on the region never really liked the AFPAC construct, I think for starters, because no one in Pakistan or Afghanistan liked it either. But I think it does allow us to look at conflict in this region within the regional context, which it really needs to be looked at. You can't cut off Afghanistan, Pakistan from the broader region. Unfortunately, our director for our South Asia program, Weed Yusuf, couldn't be with us today. He's in Istanbul. We do have our director for our Afghanistan and Central Asia program, Scott Smith, with us here. But for many of you who are regular attenders, I just wanted to let you know about our new structure, which was launched, I have to say, a little bit with a whimper rather than bang, because it was launched on October 1st, just as the government shut down. So this is one of our first public events where we've had an opportunity to announce that. Thank you all for coming. I think we have a very excellent, important topic, an excellent team of panelists here to discuss it. We're basically here to launch our new USIP publication, Domestic Barriers to Dismantling the Militant Infrastructure in Pakistan. We're fortunate to have the author, Dr. Stephen Tankel, with us here to present the findings, and then two excellent commentators, Dr. Tom Lynch and Dr. Dan Marky, to discuss it. Certainly Friday's event and the killing of Hakim al-Massoud, the head of the TTP, brought the whole issue of militant groups back into the headlines. Unfortunately, they're often in the headlines. And I think, I think we should have a very interesting discussion, I think, and I hope today, just on some of the perennial discussions around militant groups in Pakistan, to what extent the ineffectiveness of cracking down on them by the Pakistan government. Are these capacity issues? Are these will issues? What combination of the two? And this report, I think, provides an excellent and nuanced assessment of that very issue. The author is Dr. Stephen Tankel, who's an assistant professor at American University, non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and an adjunct staff member at the RAND Corporation. Dr. Tankel specializes in international security with a focus on political and military affairs in South Asia, transnational threats, especially insurgency and terrorism, and U.S. foreign and defense policies related to these issues. He's also the author of a very well acclaimed book, one of the leading books in terms of trying to understand the Lashkar-e-Taiba group, called Storming the World Stage, The Story of Lashkar-e-Taiba. Professor Tankel received his PhD in War Studies from King's College in London, has an MSc from the London School of Economics, and a BS from Cornell University. After that, Dr. Tankel will present the key findings from his paper, and then we'll have a discussion on that. And the first discussant will be Dr. Dan Marky. Dan is a senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he specialized in security and governance issues in South Asia. He has recently published a book on the future of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship called No Exit from Pakistan, America's Tortured Relationship with Islamabad. So another book I'd highly recommend, again, describing what has indeed been a very difficult relationship of late, but also one that from which there indeed it's hard to exit, given the important nature of the issues that keep our countries together, again, often in a very tortured, and as someone else described, a difficult marriage, but a marriage in which divorce is not an option. From 2003 to 2007, Dr. Marky held the South Asia portfolio on the Secretary's policy planning staff at the U.S. Department of State. Prior to government service, he taught at Princeton University, where he served as executive director of Princeton's research program in international security. Dan earned a bachelor's degree in international studies from the Johns Hopkins University and a doctorate in politics from Princeton University. And last but not least, we'll have Tom Lynch with us, Distinguished Research Fellow for South Asia and the Near East at the Institute of National Strategic Studies at the NDU. He is an expert on the South Asia region and the Gulf Arab states, as well as the past and future trajectory of radical Islam. Prior to joining NDU in 2010, Dr. Lynch had a distinguished 28-year career as an active duty U.S. Army officer, where he served in a variety of command and staff positions. Dr. Lynch holds a Bachelor of Science from the United States Military Academy and an MPA, MA, and PhD in International Relations from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Stephen, and then on to Tom, and then we'll conclude with Dan, and then, as I said, hopefully plenty of time for a good discussion.
Andrew, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'd like to thank you, and I know Moeed, who's not here, and USIP for publishing this report and holding this launch. I know it wasn't easy with the shutdown. It was a bit of a moving target in terms of scheduling it. So I'm honored to be one of the first events for the newly launched Center for South and Central Asia. I'd like to also thank Tom for being here to launch this, and also for his efforts at NDU to support some of my research, and finally Dan for being here as well. He has written an excellent book, which I've started but not yet finished, but from what I've read, very much enjoyed and highly recommend. So this report was a long time in the making, and inevitably some of it has been overtaken by events, which is, as it happens with policy reports. But I think there's still much that is relevant. I was spurred to undertake the project at a time when calls to, quote, do more were constant, and the focus was very much on the Haqqanis, other Afghan-centric actors, as well as groups like LET. And statements and messaging about Pakistan's failure to dismantle the militant infrastructure often started and ended with the geopolitical utility that some of the groups offered. Thankfully, we've moved on from that, but then came much optimism about the elevation by the Pakistani security establishment of internal security, and then some walking back off of that, as it appeared that might have been slightly too hopeful in its optimism. What I would argue, and what I have argued in this paper, is that Pakistan's security policy has always been both India-centric and concerned about the internal integrity of the state. That these two priorities are mutually reinforcing. Internal cohesion is believed to be necessary to check Indian aggression, and thus weakness at home puts the country at greater risk to external threats. Simultaneously, external challenges inevitably affect Pakistan at home, and New Delhi has historically been suspected of designs to dismember Pakistan from within. Increasingly, the U.S. and to a degree Afghanistan are blamed as well. Now, although a strategic shift has not occurred regarding the maintenance of a militant infrastructure for geopolitical purposes, threats to the state from a subset of Islamist militants significantly influence Pakistani leaders' decision-making. Civilian and military leaders do appear to recognize the dangers certain militants pose to the state and take the problem seriously. And the country's main political parties are not as wedded to a policy of maintaining proxies as both the military and the ISI are. However, they're also, as we've seen, more anxious to make peace with anti-state militants. It's unclear, though, whether the military leadership agrees on the extent and nature of the internal threat or what to do about it. It is clear that the establishment's preoccupation with maintaining jihadist proxies to be used for geopolitical purposes is still a major barrier to dismantling the militant infrastructure in Pakistan. But in this report, I argue that there are numerous other endogenous barriers that reinforce the status quo when it comes to a lack of action against militancy. My overarching aim was to highlight the fact that Pakistan faces a number of domestic barriers, many but not all of which are of its own making. Now, I should note that as the U.S. is transitioning out of Afghanistan, there seems to be an acknowledgement within our own security establishment of the need to move away from an AQ-centric, an Afghan-centric security posture to one that places greater importance on Pakistan's stability. So my hope is that this report will help inform that discussion, what those policies might look like. There have been nuanced discussions of Pakistan's inability to combat its own anti-state militants. And so some of what I'll talk about today will probably be familiar to many of you. My aim partly was to pull all of this together into one place and then after marshaling that evidence to take a step back and say, okay, given that, what are the implications for Pakistan and what are the implications for the U.S. As we go forward post-2014? I broke down the barriers to action into 3 buckets, strategic and perceptual barriers being the first, political barriers being the second, and then structural barriers, including capacity shortfalls, and I'd argue the more important systemic obstacles that exist. Those will constitute the first 3 parts of my talk. In the fourth, I'll talk about the implications for Pakistan, and then I'll close with some top-line recommendations for Washington. Now, I should note, it's tempting to try to peg all of this to the negotiations or to the recent drone strike against Hakimullah Masood. I'm going to sort of resist that temptation and try to keep the focus squarely on the findings in the report, which I do think have much bearing on the state of play today and inform both what has happened and how we'll go forward, and hopefully we can get into that during discussion, and I'm sure that our discussions will touch upon it. In terms of perceptual and strategic barriers, let me start by saying that, and this will probably be familiar to some in the room, the perception exists that the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, pressure on Pakistan, and use of drone strikes catalyzed the insurgency that the country now faces. Indeed, not too long ago, the all-parties conference resolution blamed the, quote, illegal and immoral drone strikes and the blowback from the action of NATO ISAF forces in Afghanistan for the insurgency in Pakistan. Members of the security establishment also point to formerly pro-state militants who were, quote, in the system and are now, quote, out of the system as evidence of the blowback that comes from bowing to U.S. pressure. In my conversations with various members of the Pakistani security services, that's something that I heard repeatedly. We had control over these guys. You forced us to crack down on them. Now we don't. And of course, many Pakistanis, including some in the security establishment, also believe that foreign powers, India, sometimes America, for good measure Israel, and now Afghanistan, are using the Pakistani Taliban and other anti-state militants against Pakistan. So where do some of these perceptions leave us in terms of the strategic calculus? Whether or not these perceptions are actually internalized by the people making the decisions, those people are no doubt informed by the perceptions that exist within the wider populace. Well, with pro-state groups like LAT and the Haqqanis, it's relatively straightforward. First, if we don't hit them, they won't hit us. Pakistan is facing a pretty lethal insurgency. You have groups that are attacking the Pakistani state, and you have groups that aren't. So yes, actors like LAT and the Haqqanis are useful outside of Pakistan. But it's not as though the TTP has never attacked a NATO or ISAF soldier in Afghanistan, or has never, had designs on attacking India. I would argue the greater dividing line is between those who do and don't attack the Pakistani state. And so, quite frankly, for the Pakistanis, groups that aren't attacking the Pakistani state, well, they don't really want to engage in activities that will lead them to start. It's pretty straightforward. I think that's probably something that we're quite familiar with. Digging a little below the surface, though, there's also, in conversations with members of the security establishment and others, this idea that for those who have internalized the notion of a proxy war against Pakistan, you, meaning India, Israel, Afghanistan, and America have your Taliban, so we need our Taliban. This idea that LAT and the Haqqanis and the Afghan Taliban are necessary to balance against what is seen as an externally supported proxy war against Pakistan. Of course, the recent arrest of an Afghan interlocutor trying to engage the TTP for exactly this purpose, not going to help the cause of those who are trying to beat back these conspiracy theories. And then, of course, there's the fact that these groups that do have utility externally, like the Haqqanis and LAT, also have utility internally. Now, on the one hand, the pro-state infrastructure that exists is used by anti-state militants, madrasas, training camps, etc. I get into that extensively in the report, and I'm happy to talk about those sort of, more meso-level or granular militant dynamics. But what I want to focus on here is the fact that at the same time, pro-state groups are used against anti-state groups in Pakistan. So the Haqqanis primarily act as a diplomatic interface and have been used to try to reorient violence externally, to try to bring pressure to bear or ideological pressure to move the TTP towards attacking in Afghanistan rather in Pakistan. LET has gone even further. In addition to being used as an ideological buttress against revolutionary ideology, promoting an ideological discourse that says it's not right to fight against your fellow Muslims, they've also been used to gather intelligence on the TTP and at times for actual direct action against TTP, as well as, by the way, Baluch separatists in Baluchistan, but that's another story entirely. So these pro-state groups have utility internally as well as externally, is really the point that I'm trying to make. Now, in terms of anti-state groups like the TTP and its affiliates, the perceptions and misperceptions that exist act as barriers there as well. The notion that these are sons of the soil who are reacting to the U.S. presence and to U.S. pressure, rather than being committed jihadists who want to overthrow the regime in Islamabad and institute their version of Sharia, has traction and contributes to this idea that these are actors that can be negotiated with and brought to the table. I would argue, it's for Pakistan to decide whether or not to move forward in negotiations, and we can have discussions about when the right time, to engage in negotiations is. What we've seen from, the academic literature and research and everything else. For here, I just want to make one quick point, and that's the idea that this is solely about the U.S. presence in Afghanistan or U.S. drones is false. And the late Hakimullah Masood said so himself in a BBC interview last month when he said, yes, this is about America's presence and drone strikes, but it doesn't end there. We don't like the system in Pakistan, and we want to replace it with an Islamic system. Nevertheless, this fuels the idea that it's possible to cultivate a relationship of restraint and mutual tolerance with these groups along the lines of those that exist with pro-state groups. And I would also posit, and this is something that we can get into during discussion as well, that because the PMLN and PTI were spared violence during the election season, because they have vote banks that historically are closer to some of these groups, that this has reinforced that perception, and that perception persists despite the spate of attacks that followed the elections. And none of this has eroded the public desire for negotiations. Before I move on to political barriers, let me just make a couple quick final points on this. Previous peace accords failed. And if talks did begin, and it now looks like they won't, my sense is these probably would have foundered as well, given the Pakistani Taliban's maximalist position, the fact that it was not operating from a position of weakness. The drone strike that killed Hakimullah probably either prevented or forestalled the inevitable failure of peace talks. But it's also going to feed conspiracies, as it already has, that the U.S. was trying to scupper peace talks in the region. And ultimately, at the heart of this is a fear of further escalating violence. Pakistan has lost 50,000 plus of its citizens. So it's easy to sit here in Washington, D.C. and say that they need to put the TTP down and not negotiate. It's also not difficult to understand why there are plenty of people in Pakistan looking for a negotiated solution with those attacking the state and who are reluctant to act against those who are not. And whether or not we agree or disagree with Pakistan's desire to move forward on negotiations, and there are plenty of levers that we can try to pull in private, this is ultimately a decision that Pakistan is going to have to make. In any event, fear of blowback is also a political barrier, and I want to move on to those now. And I'll be a bit more brief on the political and the structural barriers than I was on the strategic ones. In terms of political barriers, let me start by saying that during its term, the TTP often avoided responsibility on security issues, both to avoid challenging the military and to escape blame for any backlash that might ensue from aggressive action against militancy. Nawaz Sharif's government has flexed its civilian authority, albeit cautiously, including by pursuing negotiations despite the fact that the military was not bullish about the prospects. Now, Pakistan's civil-military relationship is a subject in and of itself. Let me keep my comments here to the subject at hand and make just two observations. First, Both sides, civilian and military, use militant groups as political proxies or pawnbrokers. The USIP Pakistan Council is the most recent and obvious manifestation of this in terms of the military's engagement with militant, religious, political parties. But Pakistan's major civilian parties are guilty of seeking support from Islamist organizations tied to militant groups to secure electoral gains as well. Second, civilian politicians are not entangled with pro-state militant groups like the Haqqani Network or LET to nearly the same extent as the military. At the same time, whereas the military has recently taken a harder line against anti-state militants, civilian politicians are the ones looking to cultivate a relationship of restraint and mutual tolerance with them, as I said. Part of this stems from a result of experiences at the provincial level, I would argue, in TTP, where these sorts, in Punjab province, where these types of deals had some success. They were able to sort of pursue a not in my backyard type of approach. Go be active somewhere else, don't be active here. It also results from the fact that the current government, I would argue, needs to shore up its right flank and sometimes takes public positions that are at odds with its private objectives. But as with any political discourse, this can lock you into a specific path. What has all this meant? It means that militants have arrogated political power, which naturally makes them more difficult to dislodge. And here, let me just share a quick anecdote before I move on to structural barriers. I was sitting with a high-ranking PMLN official some time ago and talking about the fact that the PMLN had courted the head of the SSP, USIP Pakistan, a sectarian militant organization for votes. And he said to me, isn't it better to have these actors in the political system than engaging in militancy? And my response was, yes, it is better to have them in the political system than engaging in militancy. But up until this point, they haven't been forced to choose. They're able to do both. And we've yet to see any real process in place for moving them from one to the other. So right now, militants are able to have their cake and eat it too, in terms of behaving as political actors. Finally, structural barriers. Plenty of ink's been spilled on Pakistan's capacity shortfalls, so I'm not going to go into those. I want to just note that civilian authorities and the military are constrained by a lack of capabilities and overall capacity. Andrew and I were talking beforehand. I'm happy to get into these during the Q&A. My feeling is capacity is a difficult nut to crack, but it is probably the easiest one because it simply takes resources channeled to the right place. You know, the political problems and the systemic and organizational barriers that exist are much more difficult to overcome. And I want to highlight some of those systemic challenges here. The first is just an abject lack of military and civilian coordination. ISI, IB, FIA, these groups do not play well in the sandbox. Tom may wish to comment a bit more on the ISI-S, ISI-CT divide. For here, I'll simply say that ISI-CT was an entity that was created with U.S. support and sponsorship, and it is at odds with the S-wing of the ISI, which is responsible for the militant portfolio, and so the latter will often undercut the former. ISI-CT itself is not constitutionally mandated to be, sort of undertaking counterterrorism law enforcement responsibilities, but because it's the most powerful actor, it does. And so you get people who are arrested who can't be prosecuted. You also get a lot of gray areas for civilians who don't know which militant is off limits, which militant isn't off limits, where they can act, where they can't act. And when you have gray areas in this type of a situation, often the best thing is to simply step back and do nothing from your own personal sort of, professional and personal survival perspective. I would also note that civilian coordination between the federal and provincial levels, certainly when you had a PPP government at the federal level and a PMLN government at the provincial level, was sorely lacking. You also have a lack of interagency coordination at the federal level. We have incredible politicization of the police and the civilian intelligence agencies. And we have a need for a real legislative overhaul. The misuse of anti-terrorism courts, for example, leads to a paltry conviction rate. There are many other contributing factors as well. Now, since this report was put in for publication, legislation has been passed for NACTA, amendments to the Anti-Terrorism Act, including beefing up witness and prosecutor protection, the Pakistani Protection Ordinance. Those are all to the good, but it's too early to say what the impact will be. And many of the systemic issues that I've mentioned, especially in terms of coordination, it's going to take a lot of time. So it's good to see action. This is a new government. We'll have to wait and see what the impact is. In the meantime, I think there's more than enough fodder to tease out some of the implications for Pakistan and top-line recommendations for Washington, and I'll close with these. For Pakistan, just a general observation that doesn't apply solely there, and that's that security is not divisible. And what do I mean by that? I mean this idea that we can, or that Pakistan can build a strong CT architecture in a vacuum is not going to work. So while I applaud the efforts to beef up CT in the short term, there's a generation's worth of work to be done in terms of security sector reform in Pakistan. The second point I want to make is the importance of building civilian leadership capacity. Now, when I wrote the report, I was talking about sort of NSC versus DCC. Pakistan has, pushed forward to reconstitute an NSC. I would say that what's really going to matter there is a permanent secretariat. They need staff that meets regularly. This can't just be principals coming together. Okay, you need a lot of staffers who are educated and knowledgeable to be able to move these issues forward. That's also very important for civilian confidence. Some people in the room will probably be familiar with the dynamic that occurs when there's Pakistani military and civilians sitting in a room talking about security issues. The civilians are very often silent. So civilian confidence building in these areas is very important. NACTA has been passed. As I said, we'll need to wait to see, if that actually eventuates. I would argue that a lot of politics are going to need to be put aside. And then finally, there's a need to formulate and coordinate a CT strategy. And that strategy is going to be little if it's not enforced. Now, the first step is creating one. There's one reportedly in the works. For what it's worth, I'd like to just offer a few thoughts about what I think is going to need to be in there. First, formally assigned responsibilities for the Army, ISI, CT, IB, FIA, police, and other official entities. Second, outlining a way to pair governance and development with counterinsurgency and CT. Third, codifying means through which intelligence sharing and coordination among various authorities occurs. Fourth, providing a mechanism for clarifying how Pakistan intends to augment its existing but very inchoate de-radicalization efforts. Fifth, developing a coherent narrative beyond, give peace a chance. Now, for Washington, and I'll conclude with these. I know that I'm bumping up against time here, for which I apologize. First and foremost, I think the U.S. needs to revise its counterterrorism architecture in line with the decreasing threat from AQ and the growing potential for regional attacks against U.S. interests and regional instability after 2014. I think there's probably an awareness of that need, but I don't necessarily know that we've thought through what that looks like. As events of the last weekend show, unilateral action is not necessarily going to be a sustainable way forward. So given all of these challenges that Pakistan faces and the endogenous nature of many of them, that it's not just about changing Pakistan's calculus geopolitically, I think we're going to need a more nuanced rethink of what our own CT strategy looks like. Second, I would argue that more important than capacity building is taking steps to boost the capabilities and confidence of the new civilian government and to improve its understanding of the security threat at the local, provincial, and federal levels. I'd recommended a high-level dialogue. That's already taking place. Good, we can scratch that off the books. I think helping the civilians to write laws and offering technical assistance in those areas is important. We can talk about Hakim Mullah during the Q&A. Finally, a couple points on security sector assistance and military assistance. I'm one who thinks that we need to maintain a military-to-military relationship, with assistance being primarily transactional, that is provided in return for assistance or progress in clearly identified areas or focused on areas of convergence. In terms of security sector assistance, one of the points that I've made repeatedly is I think it needs to be spread more evenly throughout the country and redirected to include areas where Pakistan has demonstrated proficiency or pressing need, which is to say, focusing it all in the frontier areas and buying people armored vehicles and building police stations. Those are things that Pakistan could and should be doing for itself. There are other areas where I think we could be spending our money a bit more wisely, and I think there are a lot of problems outside of the tribal areas that need to be addressed, and it's going to be addressing those problems that's going to give the civilian government and the military the confidence to move forward against some of the anti-state militants in its midst. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I got the order wrong in my introductory remarks, so I think we'll go next with Tom and then conclude with Dan.
Great. Thanks so much, Andrew, and thanks for having me here today, and thanks at a distance to Moeed and the new head of the program, who's been instrumental in a number of critical events here in his past life, and I know will continue to have superlative efforts here going forward. It's with great pleasure that I'm here to talk to you, and I'm going to try to keep my remarks to about 10 minutes, but I'll start with a couple of disclaimers and waivers. First, disclaimer. Stephen and I have known each other for quite a while, and I've been personally privileged to see the amount of work, effort, and on-the-ground time that Stephen has dedicated to what you see in the results of this work, which is also, I think he'd be the first to admit, informed other works that have been very useful to me personally and to others, in the U.S. government as well as in the open community. So that tradition continues with this piece, and I personally am proud and honored to have been able to see him progress with this work. Second, as Andrew alluded to, for those of you who don't know me, my sordid military background included about my last 3 years in uniform, trekking around different places with Admiral Mullen to include Pakistan. Now, I didn't make anywhere near the 27 different trips he made that caused him to come into contact with General Kayani and other senior leaders, but I do think there is probably an imprint of my rear end cheek somewhere in a stool outside the watch office where the Pakistani chief of the army staff resides, because I spent too many a late night there waiting for my boss to come out from private conversations. Having said that as a background, the perspective that I bring to this perhaps is a little bit one of saying that Stephen's point of departure, I think here, is exactly right. He started with a point of departure that says there is a absolute continuity between Pakistan's perception of its external threats and its internal ones, and really to understand what its ties are to militants and to break through the patterns of misunderstanding that we in America have had for a long, long time. And I'll allude to a couple of those that I think have occurred, just within the last 5 to 6 years that have been pretty significant. We need to understand that. And we need to understand that Pakistan treats a general level of acquiescence to jihad, if not outright sponsorship of it, as an essential portion of its statecraft, an essential portion of its survival, if you will, against what it sees, especially in its military and intelligence communities, as an implacable existential threat from India. And here, when you look at the numbers of approximately 6 to 1 in terms of population difference, a growing military trajectory and spending on conventional forces now in India that's rapidly approaching 10 to 1 over Pakistan. I mean, you can see, if you sit in the chair of a Pakistani security leader, why that would be fearsome and why you would need to find a way to thicken your ability to neutralize that Indian potential threat. But here, I think Stephen's report gets us beyond that in a very set of useful ways, in that it talks about the fact that the way in which the militant milieu has developed over time has really put Pakistan in a place where its efforts by its military intelligence apparatus to use militancy as a tool of state, indeed to try to cultivate nationalist Islamists to pursue activities in places like Jammu and Kashmir, Afghanistan, and, as Stephen correctly notes here, in the very process of political discourse in the country. Let's remind ourselves again, as Stephen has in this text, that groups like Lashkar-e-Janvi and Sepa-e-Saba exist primarily to perpetrate violence against Pakistani Shia or other non-Sunni Pakistani groups. And so I think what Stephen offers us here is this notion that while the strategic perspective in terms of its outside use of these groups is important as a foundation, there are implications inside the state which he expands. So in general, this milieu of groups, well over 3 dozen by my last count, and Stephen highlights a number of them in here that have evolved and name changed over time. I mean, from that perspective, there really is a history here of there being state acquiescence, if not outright support by the security intelligence apparatus for groups that are anti-Indian, pro-Sunni, and pro-state, right? And as Stephen highlights in this report, the interface and the separation between those has blurred dramatically from some point within the last 12 years. Pakistanis that I engage with, and I engage with a lot of military in my current capacity, in my past capacities, point right where Stephen has said they point. They point to the U.S. arrival in Afghanistan. They point to our activities to support other entities as being this point from which anti-state of Pakistan elements within these militia groups have generated. The bad Taliban, if you will, have morphed out of the good Taliban. But having said that, there's also a line of thought which says that, it's Pakistan's internal policies and pursuits that have fueled this internal metamorphosis as well. And people that wish to point to that, I think, can point effectively to things like Lal Masjid and other ways in which the government of Pakistan interacted during the Musharraf era and then beyond with respect to some of these groups because of a left-hand, right-hand interaction and dynamic that Stephen points to in here. Because of the fact that the civilian organizations on the intelligence side and the civilian organizations on the economic and the political and the legislative side do not penetrate into many of the areas where these groups find their lease on life or are not challenged in these areas, means that whereas Stephen notes here, there may be some successes by the government of the last 4 to 5 years in places like southern Punjab in finding a modus vivendi with some of these groups. There is not a similar one that's transpired in places like the old Northwest Frontier Province, currently Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or the Fatah, or Baluchistan, much less in areas that abut and are against Jammu and Kashmir. So I think all this is an important set of elements that Stephen brings to bear in this piece and is part of the reason why I commend it absolutely so much. Now, having said that, I think that there's a couple of things that one needs to look at in terms of going forward here that Stephen does a tremendous job of scratching the surface on, but that we may want to explore more both in question and answer and in terms of policy consideration. First, inside Pakistan. I think the importance of this work, is incandescent. That is, it's as relevant now as it would have been a couple of years ago because as things move on in Pakistan, those of us who watch it carefully are always trying to discern where in this process this kind of military intelligence affiliation with militias as being a vitally important ingredient that even though it's got some Frankenstein features to it must be retained, where that transitions such that civilians in leadership positions, who as Stephen correctly notes, haven't got clean hands in this, but perhaps may see more of the danger on the horizon than some in the military intelligence apparatus do, where you get to a point where there can be changes organizationally, politically, and as he says, structurally, to make things work. And here I think Stephen highlights the fact that you've really got to have some significant and substantive changes. And if you sum together what he's recommending, I would argue too, these are non-trivial changes in the way Pakistan has done business and the way even in which the PLMN government starts right now in terms of doing business. To say that you need to find a better way for the intelligence agencies like the Civilian-led Intelligence Bureau, the more federal police, FIA, some of the local constituencies, and then the ISI to get along with each other, that's not asking a little, okay? There's at least a 30-year pedigree here where ISI really controls, and this is where it's important again in terms of that outside and inside threat, a framework that's somewhat alien to those of us that work in the West, all right? Because of the fact ISI has an external bureau, as Stephen's talked about, its S Bureau, which we know, although there's not a lot written on it, has responsibility for its training of militants to help support and defend the state, but it also has an ISIC, which is its internal security bureau, which looks a lot more like internal security apparatuses that we have known and sometimes disliked in more totalitarian societies in terms of managing political access, those two entities in and of themselves can clash over who shares evidence, who picks stuff up. If somebody's in trouble with a local police affiliate, you know, who gets turned to at the corner ISI office to decide what to do. And there are many anecdotes, and Stephen refers to a couple of them in here, where, you know, he's uncovered, and I'm aware of the fact that, you know, you've had a legitimate criminal picked up, brought to a police office somewhere in Punjab. The ISI office around the corner has an ISIC representative who says, yeah, go ahead and collect evidence, and then the next day that's reversed, because somebody in ISI's figured out that they may in fact be on the payroll somewhere doing something that's uniform and useful. Now, it's not to say that doesn't happen in liberal Western societies. It is instead to say, though, it happens a lot more conspicuously and dramatically in Pakistan for the reasons that we've discussed. And then we have this other group that Stephen talks about in the paper, the ISI-CT arrangement, also led for the last almost a decade by a two-star, but that really struggles for oxygen and struggles for space, not only to develop a counterterrorism strategy, but also to have voice and presence in a world where ISIC and ISIS are fighting for oxygen and trying to decide who has the most dominant authoritative line there. So those have to be definitely redressed. And empowering and enhancement of the civilian entities and organs of government, I think, is an aspiration that has existed for a long time. And there have been many different incarnations of that, whether it be the 1990s and trying to help Sharif 1.0 and Sharif 2.0 and find and establish legs and civilian leadership in some of these security areas, or the two Bhutto governments. We're now entering, I would argue to you, about a fifth iteration on trying to find a way forward. Actually, it should be a sixth, because we also tried this with the PPP under Zardari. And whether or not Sharif can progress beyond Zardari's efforts in this area, I still think remains an open book. And we need to look carefully at whether or not this can happen. Because Steve and I have had this conversation. You know, when I look back to 2008, 2009, there was great optimism in this country that the civilian government and therefore the military government of Pakistan did get the threat and the risk internal. There was a belief and an assessment that SWAT indicated you can't brand bad Taliban and good Taliban because the lines are blurred too much. And yet what we found out in reality was we really couldn't get beyond that. We could not empower civilian organizations and agencies. There were some established. There was an abortive attempt that was reported out of Pakistan to establish a civilian-led national security plan and a national security strategy. Those appeared to founder against military intelligence resistance. There was an effort, some of you may remember, post-Mumbai, for the civilian leadership of Pakistan to volunteer that the ISI head go lead or at least participate in a joint investigation in India. That quickly got retracted by senior spokespeople from ISI PR, the voice of the military. So I think we're in the process of finding out now whether these laws, as Stephen has correctly noted, with respect to a reframing of NACTA, a reframing of some of the civilian agencies, whether those will in fact get legs, or whether in fact they will kind of lie in this murky no man's land of legislative debate and jujitsu and never quite take frame or focus. One, because civilian politicians remain wary of the long shadow of military intervention in domestic politics, or two, whether it's just a bridge too far. And so finally within that, I think it is a worthwhile time to have a conversation about how much, how far, and what can be done to help Pakistan going forward. And unfortunately now that has to be done, unlike 5 years ago, in an environment in this country of receding means, of receding interest, and of kind of, you know, a lack of enthusiasm that we had back at the time that senior leaders in our government produced this thing called the Kerry-Lugar-Berman Bill, which was a promise for $5 billion over 5 years to do things precisely in terms of capacity building. All right? Those efforts foundered. The question now is, can we find the will to do some of the wise things Stephen recommends, even at the same time that we take a healthy, if somewhat skeptical attitude about whether or not the military and intelligence apparatus can in fact wean itself to the point of allowing the civilian organizations to take more of a lead and more of an effort, as Stephen advocates in this paper. So with thanks for your time and attention and looking forward to the conversation, and thanks for a wonderful piece, Stephen, I turn it over.
Thanks, Tom. Dan.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Stephen, and thanks to Moeed if he's listening somewhere. It's great to be able to join you. Is there a way to turn this so it's buzzing a lot? I don't know if this one is maybe better. Okay, thanks. Let me begin with sharing some of similar observations, as Tom has also suggested with regard to Stephen's work. I mean, I think by and large, I would subscribe to much of what is in this report. It's well put together, it is thorough, and it importantly includes a fair bit of detail and history that I think for anybody who's trying to get up to speed on these issues is really invaluable. So I can commend it on all of those counts. He's absolutely right in terms of his attempt to connect problems of Pakistan's political will, problems of its capacity, problems of its broader strategy, and to see how each of these kind of fits together to make it very difficult, far more difficult than I think many Americans would like to believe, for it to go after some of the threats that are on its own soil. Now, Andrew was kind enough to mention my book and even flash it up there. Please do buy it if you happen to be on Amazon. But I would say here in the book, there are a number of areas where I overlap in terms of my analysis with Stephen. And what I conclude is that we've got a fundamental sticking point here in the U.S.-Pakistan relationship with respect to its behavior in dealing with these groups. This is not merely a minor issue of a disagreement, a tactical disagreement. This has become a fundamental barrier to closer cooperation. And in my estimate, it is a fundamental political barrier that will keep us on shaky ground in our relationship as the years go forward. And there's a problem there, which is that it is a very important problem. That is that Pakistan continues to use these groups as proxies in its relations with India, with Afghanistan, that these groups have our blood on their hands, American blood on their hands, and that they are ultimately a threat to, I think, a stable and moderate Pakistan itself. Those are all problems. But we also have other very large strategic concerns in Pakistan that go even beyond this, that make it, that is Pakistan's nuclear program, that is Pakistan's relationship with India moving forward, that is Pakistan's emerging relationship with China, particularly as China expands its influence and interest in the region. So the broader geostrategic or geopolitical concerns that we have go well beyond the question of internal militancy. And yet, internal militancy could be a fundamental barrier to our cooperation and our dealings with Pakistan because of the politics. Simply put, because of the politics here in Washington, make it very difficult, and I'd say closer and closer to impossible, to cooperate with a country that behaves like an enemy. And you know, we should put a clear emphasis on this, and this is something we have to find a way forward on. And here's where I would want more clarification or more from Stephen, because, and even more actually from my own work, and I'm trying to deliver that in, you know, sort of post-book projects, because what he and in many ways I have called for is, as he, I think he puts it, kind of a narrow transactionalism with Pakistan's military on areas of common interest. Okay, that's fine, but can't we do somewhat better than that? Aren't there ways that we might, and we've all confronted this problem of Pakistan trying to get it to make a real strategic shift on these issues. And again, the need for this is a political need, that we can't build a relationship where we cooperate on other issues if this fundamental sticking block continues. And the problem with a narrow military-to-military transactionalism is that it simply doesn't aim at that more fundamental change. It is far less ambitious in its approach. It may be more politically realistic at this point, but then it doesn't solve the problem that we've got a fundamental sticking point that could derail our broader interests in cooperation with Pakistan. So as I've been thinking through this set of issues, I've looked at various points that were real or potential turning points in our relationship with Pakistan of the recent past. And of course, the immediate post-9/11 example is one, and the post-Bin Laden raid is another. And what is striking about the first is that while we didn't achieve a full strategic shift on Pakistan's part after 9/11, we achieved a considerable and important strategic shift on a variety of issues that were of top concern to us, and I would argue created an opportunity for a more thoroughgoing and lasting change that we ultimately didn't seize as an opportunity. And in the book, I try to elaborate on why that wasn't the case in the years 2002 to 2007. In the post-Bin Laden period, what I would say in the immediate aftermath of that raid is that we also had a keen vulnerability on the part of the Pakistani state, an opportunity to press an advantage at high risk, admittedly, to us and to the relationship. But what it suggested to me, like the post-9/11 period, is that it's not enough to look for areas of greater assistance that we might provide. It's not enough to try to cultivate a closer relationship, as Admiral Mullen did, and I think in many ways that made sense, but it's not enough to do that. It's not enough to dangle the carrot of military, considerable military, or even considerable civilian assistance, if your goal is to get Pakistan to shift its behavior on things that are going to be highly costly to it, including its relations with some of these proxy groups. However, if you can combine all of those things with a considerable increase in coercive capacity or leverage, then perhaps you have a better shot. And the post-9/11 period is the only or best example of a moderate success on that score. So I can't say that this is a risk-free or likely to succeed strategy. But I would ask, and this is the thing that's been on my mind over the past weekend, I would ask whether, in the case of the Hakimullah Masood killing, whether we're again at a moment of lesser opportunity than the Bin Laden raid, lesser opportunity than the 9/11 experience, but greater opportunity than we've had of late to push an advantage. And here, just stepping back a little bit, I would kind of try to clarify the argument. And first of all, I have written and argued that it would have been smart for us not to undertake such drone strikes in the midst of an effort by the Pakistani state to undertake peace talks with the Pakistani Taliban. And the logic for not undertaking them was to let the peace talks fail, as I think Stephen suggested himself. Let them fail on their own. These guys are irreconcilables, and if you allow the talks to fail and show that they're irreconcilable, you will do, well, effectively, they achieved in the Swat Valley case. You will unite the Pakistani state and politics, by and large, against them and allow them to move forward without us. Now, that would have been my priority goal, but we've already launched this strike. So we're not there, and we've imposed ourselves in the midst of this Pakistani dialogue. Can we make the most of this? Can we seize this advantage? Well, let's step back and see, would there be any reasons why such a strike would make sense except for the narrow tactical benefit of killing Hakimullah Masood? Now, if you look at the nascent talks, the Pakistan TTP talks with the government, there are good reasons for great skepticism about what was actually going on here. I would wager that there would certainly be some sitting in Washington who would see these talks not, in fact, as a good faith effort or even a tactical effort to cultivate, to drive talks to get to a point where you could actually attack the Taliban, but in fact as temporizing, as a more of a do-nothing policy. And beyond that, potentially, to try to encourage the Pakistani Taliban to launch their attacks into Afghanistan. In other words, to become more like the Haqqani network and less as the Pakistani Taliban have been over recent years, to provide them or offer them the opportunity to shift gears and push their violence outside of Pakistan rather than inside. Now, that concern or skepticism may be warranted, maybe not, but if you look at the way that Nawaz Sharif and his party have acted in Punjab, you'll see precisely that nature of the relationship that they've cultivated with Lashkar-e-Taiba. So if they were seeking to replicate something similar with the TTP in Fatah, as they have with LET in Punjab, then this would be of serious concern to us, and this would be something that we would want, in fact, to put a stop to or to create a problem for. Now, we've created a problem for it. So now, was that our purpose? I don't think so. I think our purpose was more narrowly tactical. But suppose that we just play this out a little bit further. What should be our goal moving forward? I would argue it should be to try and drive a further wedge between the government in Islamabad, the ruling PMLN party government, and the military, between them and the TTP going forward. Right now, the problem is that you have the TTP and Imran Khan, and in fact, many of the members of the ruling party actually closing ranks and criticizing us. What we want is precisely the opposite. We want to drive a wedge between them. Now, how do we do that? Well, first of all, I think we can be hopeful that the TTP will do it for us. And that is because one of their likely responses to this killing of Hakimullah Masood is that they will go on a murderous rampage inside of Pakistan and kill a lot of their fellow citizens. If that happens, and if that happens in the context of us quietly approaching senior leaders within the Pakistani military, ISI, as well as civilian leaders, with a plan to take advantage of the disarray caused by the killing of Hakimullah Masood within the ranks of the TTP. In other words, to advance a military and intelligence offensive at this moment, rather than backing off, rather than trying to patch things up, to actually press a more aggressive agenda at this time. If that happens in the context of a TTP rise in violence inside of Pakistan, while they won't be happy with it, that is, Nawaz Sharif and company won't be pleased with this, and we won't find any love, we may find that we can rekindle an alliance of convenience that will certainly serve our interests better than anything that we've had of late, and may serve to ward off the problem of temporizing with an enemy, that is the TTP, that is in fact an enemy to the Pakistani state, but isn't appreciated as such, as widely or politically as it needs to be. So put that on the table and look forward to conversation.
Thank you very much. I'll give Stephen a first chance to respond to those comments, and then we'll open it up. Although I have many questions myself, I'll hold back. So over to you.
I mean, I would just make a couple of broad points. The broadest I would make is, in sort of true academic fashion, I think I spent a lot of time on the problem and not as much time as I should have on the solutions. And so I just wanted to sort of give kind of a top-line overview that I should have mentioned before, especially to Tom's point, but also to Dan's, in terms of how I envision some of those more discrete pieces that I was talking about in terms of a CT architecture and focusing on building civilian intellectual capacity and things of that nature. The first what Dan, I think what you're referring to is sort of an opportunistic inflection point driven type of approach to this strategy, right? Which I think it makes eminent sense in that when there are those opportunities or those inflection points that come about, being able to press our advantage. And I certainly would concur with you that we have not always done that to the degree that we should have or could have. The other way of looking at this, which I try to get at in the paper, is that because those inflection points might not always be there, that one of the things that, and this goes to, I think, to Tom's point also about a culture of austerity. We're in the age of austerity here. We have tried in the past to build the civilian governance capabilities through a lot of money and effort and those things, and we have seen that founder. Is I guess I'm taking a more cautious, longer-term view, but also I'm looking at this by looking at the internal domestic barriers. I guess where I come down on this is Pakistan there is path dependency, and yes, there might be an inflection point where we can change that path a little bit, but I don't necessarily know that all the absent a threat to invade or bomb Pakistan back to the Stone Age, as was the apocryphal right, or perhaps not apocryphal threat after 9/11. Absent that kind of leverage and coercion, moving them off onto a different path is unlikely. And I don't think, by the way, that all the aid in the world and that all the love in the world is going to move them off that path. In the report I write, the U.S. can't fix Pakistan, only Pakistan can fix Pakistan. So I guess what I'm recommending is perhaps a more cautious, but what I also see as a more realistic do no harm type of approach, in which we start asking less about how much money we can give to something and start asking smarter questions about where we give our money. And that's why, so when I talk about building civilian governance, for me, it's much more, it's much less about nation building and large amounts of aid and much more about how can we build civilian intellectual capacity? How can we get smart people on the civilian side who can really challenge the military? And so that intellectual capacity becomes very important. And I think, there's, for me, I write a lot about, sort of, and I don't love the term, but trying to be a force multiplier in certain discrete areas. And to try to work sort of subtly to work with the Pakistanis to put in place, piece by piece, organizational components and pass legislation that over time, cumulatively, can bind them to a different path, or can make it more difficult for them to stay on the path that they're on, which is a much slower going process and does not guarantee satisfaction. And I don't necessarily know that it is in any ways incompatible with the, sort of taking advantage of an inflection point when one presents itself. It is simply to say, the U.S. can't fix this problem. We can't. What we can do is we can be a bit smarter about how we engage. We can, take care to do no harm. Not hitting Hakim Mullah Masood during negotiations, which are bound to fail, is an example of that. If we were cooperating or there was any collaboration with the Pakistani military, it certainly doesn't appear there was with the civilian government. And now we have perhaps inadvertently driven a wedge between the two, or we've wedged ourselves off from the civilian government. So it's those types of things, that I'm talking about in terms of a bigger picture.
If I could just put myself in opposition to the notion that the civilian government, which had left here 48 hours before the strike, had no knowledge.
That is fair. That is fair enough. So it's not that inflection points aren't possible, and it's not. I don't think that we're going to be able to be doing KLB in the future. So if you accept that, how do you come up with a more rational and realistic and sustainable approach that can build over time? And that's really what I'm trying to get at.
Okay, thanks. We started about 5 minutes late. We'll go 5 minutes over, so we have about a half an hour for some question and some further discussion. Over to you.
Much better. I served at the embassy in Islamabad in 2010 and 11. I did my last job with the State Department in summer of 2012, acting in Peshawar. And I guess I'm speaking from having been in Pakistan, therefore, at the time that Salman Taseer was murdered. Why isn't, which was like an enormous cold shower for all the liberals. Everyone was just terrified. No pushback. Why is there never any pushback in Pakistan? The TTP and other militant groups have been killing, as we've just said, thousands of people. There are bombs in Peshawar almost every day. We only hear about it when when the body count is really high, or Christians or some other group that's unusual are attacked. But I mean, it is every day. I've struggled myself trying to think why there is no pushback. We see in Egypt and in Tunisia and Arab Spring countries, you have a lot of pushback from the civilian, secular, established liberals against Islamists when they get to try to take over. And nothing like that ever happens in Pakistan. Instead, you have people doing a whole series of strategic retreats. Anyway, I put that to you. It's one that's puzzled me.
Thanks. Why don't we take a couple more questions and come back to the panel? Yeah, here in the front row.
Hi, Idris Ali, a graduate student at the University of Maryland and a journalist for Pakistan Press International. Stephen, you talked a bit about this provincial and federal government coordination. Recently, the PTI and Imran Khan kind of spoke about, closing the NATO supply routes. How does the federal government then deal with, militants when some of the mainstream parties are making statements where, seem very pro-militant and pro-Taliban? So if you could answer that.
Okay, we'll get our front row questions over first. So we have two more here in the front row. Then back to the panel.
So I am Dr. Nisar Chaudhry with Pakistan American League. All the distinguished panelists mentioned about the political will and the capacity and the limitations, intellectual capacity of the leadership in the political area, and then not a good alignment between military and the political establishment in Pakistan. This is a war which is a very different kind of war. Even the superpowers have not been able to successfully deal with this kind of war. Knowing Pakistan's limitations and at the same time lack of political will and absence of institutions, and USA is governed through institutions, how would you really come up with some creative thinking where Pakistan can be stabilized and there is also at the same time attitude conditioning of the political leadership done at the same time? Thank you.
We had a question in the back row, but we'll go back to you first.
I'm Harlan Ullman, a recovering friend of Pakistan. I enjoyed your comments, but I have a fundamental question. You all use the word we. Stephen, you talk about we developing intellectual capital. Tom, you have your own viewpoints, and Dan, you have a very interesting view of encouraging the split. But who are the we? When you take a look at the American side, is there anybody here really interested or knowledgeable in a position of authority who really can do anything or wishes to do anything about Pakistan? Mike Mullen was the de facto action officer for Pakistan. He's gone. Doug Lute is gone, whether Doug had any real clout in terms of policy. But the president is going to be preoccupied with the Affordable Health Care Act and God knows what else. Doesn't seem to me that Susan Rice has a particular interest in Pakistan. John Kerry is going around the world 25 times with enough crises. And Chairman of the Joint Chiefs decided that General Kiani is not going to be his best friend. So my question is, if you were trying to implement your solutions, what you think needs to be done, you talk about the we on our side. Who the hell are the we?
You want to start with Dan and then move down this way?
Stephen Engelken had a really interesting question about the lack of pushback. And I've been struggling with some of this, particularly, I have just now started to read Twitter. This is a new development in my life. I'm not sure it's a good thing, but and there is a very serious disconnect between many of the people that I seem to be following on Twitter and what I believe to be the broader narrative inside of Pakistan. And even those who are commenting, I mean, they're effectively elite liberal voices on Twitter. And many of them are quite concerned about the direction that their country seems to be taking. And they report every so often, kind of in passing, how people they meet on the street or otherwise are saying things that they find absolutely absurd. And the Hakimullah Masood killing is just one example where they seem to be reporting that many of the people they come across just see this as a further example of how America is destroying their country. Despite the fact that, 48 hours before his killing, I think many would have seen Hakimullah Masood as a genuine threat to Pakistan. So the narrative shifted very directly. So the puzzling through this strikes me as the answer is it's a matter of speech in Pakistan needs to be interpreted as political power, not as logical argument. The ability to speak what seems to be an absurdity, get away with it, and say it routinely, and to see others cower before you is a demonstration of your active power in the political environment. And that, I think, is how we have to interpret the relative silence after Salman Taseer's killing, which is that those who you would have hoped might have actively spoken up, not just on Twitter, but in fact not on Twitter, but in real places that matter in Pakistan, was not there. Why? I think that's a real indication of their sense of fear and their sense of lack of power. And that's very discouraging for those of us who would like to see better. But I think that that's probably a more accurate read than to think that there's sort of a silent majority that would like to speak up. Maybe they would, but they have assessed that their position of relative lack of power makes it dangerous for them to do so. And so they've kept silent.
Yeah, if I could, just on a couple of points. First, the one that Dan just addressed, why no pushback? Let me get ready to pass this over to Stephen, because I think he has a tremendous phrase for this when you look at the internal dynamics, which is related to the militant problem, but has independent elements of it, and that is creeping radicalism within Pakistan society. I think Dan's had a key element of it, but I think there are other sinews of that that have come over time because of the endogenization of this narrative that everybody's out to get Pakistan. Pakistan has no friends. Outsiders are the ones that create all Pakistan's problems, and therefore we have to look for an outside entity to blame, and that those that are speaking, you know, unkindly inside can't expect to be protected. Here, in this case, you know, Salman Taseer is getting assassinated by somebody in his own bodyguard. So for heaven's sake, who else can be safe? And then you, of course, have people come out and cheer because he was against the blasphemy laws. So I think that's just this process, but I'll set Stephen up for that. Second, this notion about provincialism and, you know, who's saying what, where. I mean, Imran Khan is doing nothing but tapping into a narrative that I see that's existed in Pakistan, you know, for well over a decade. And that's back to this narrative of what are the outsiders doing to us, how is it their fault and their responsibility, and what can we do to get back at them, even if it's cutting our nose off to spite our face. Now, why won't we likely see the trucking thing shut down again? Well, because as the U.S. is getting towards the end of its drawdown of equipment, those who run trucking firms recognize that that cash cow is going to walk out the barn door pretty soon, I would suggest. And therefore, I think it highly unlikely that those steps will be taken at this time, even though they were taken, you know, earlier on. Third question, what's a creative way to go forward? Well, at the risk of throwing this open, I mean, Stephen talks a lot about solutions to expand capacity internally. And to a certain extent, I am absolutely all for those. I mean, I've advocated for about 3 to 4 years that we should be seeking not a strategic change in Pakistan, but rather a transactional relationship with its military and more of a constant dialogue and interaction with its civilian leadership, its police, and its others. And I think the U.S. government has done a lot of this. USIP has done a lot of this with bringing folks in and trying to have the conversation to build the knowledge base and to build the familiarity. So it's not just about what we're doing bad in Pakistan, but it's about things we're trying to do to help them. But where can Pakistan really make a change? Well, again, I think Stephen's exactly right. We can't make a change for them, even in these great seminal moments. But there is a great seminal moment right now where I think Pakistan can have a change. It's got nothing to do with helping them internally. It's got nothing to do with, you know, striking against their militants. It's got everything to do with conditioning the next tranche of Pakistani economic help from the international community with Pakistan's agreement to expand and enhance trade with the engine of growth in South Asia, India. To me, that's the conditionality that matters, because that's the conditionality that will force the civilian bureaucracy to create accountants. It'll force books to be opened and things to be looked at that have been in the shadows. It'll force a middle class more onto the scene, even if we're talking only 5% per year going forward. That 5% would be 10 times as much in terms of economic value to Pakistanis than the $5 billion a year of Kerry Lugar Berman by estimates that have been done recently. So here's where Pakistan's internal apparatus needs help helping itself. If it's going to continue to stand in the way of trade with India, it's going to continue to not only inhibit its ability to grow economically, but it's going to continue to inhibit its ability to grow these processes, many of which Stephen is talking about right here. And finally, I think the last question had to do, Harlan, with, you know, who's going to work on this here. Well, I think you just heard me, you know, expound upon the issue. I don't see a constituency here right now. I think John Kerry's probably the last best hope, but as you said now, he's got international responsibilities. And here, you know, Pakistan may again, for about the 4th time in its history, have missed a moment, right? It may have missed a moment when the U.S. was focused and willing to help, but take no fear, back to my previous answer. If we in international fora, through our Treasury Department and our commercial enterprises, can work with the IMF, the World Bank, and the ADB, and not just fork over money and expect Pakistan to do what it's done, or do different than what's done the last 12 years, which is to fail on 11 of 12 points of conditionality, internal conditionality like taxation and subsidization and other things. If we're going to continue to do that, we're going to fail. If we instead look at conditioning this on expanded trade and access, then I think we've got a chance, slowly with these internal processes, to change a dynamic and a narrative that otherwise is going to be stubbornly resistant.
Very briefly, fear, ditto. I think that's a huge piece of it. I would also point out, you know, that part of the pushback that we see in places like, you know, Egypt and Tunisia is taking place over social media and things like that. Whereas, you know, in Pakistan, I think it's important to remember that the media is now much more open there. The problem is that the people who are on the media, who have, right, because speech is power, the people who are promoting the narrative on the media every night are speaking with a certain message, right? And I come back to that point about militant groups or religious parties connected to them arrogating power in the system, right? And they're arrogating rhetorical power, and they're arrogating political power, and they've got sort of the power of the gun, and all of that I think creates conditions where it can be very difficult to speak up. I don't want to take up too much time. I write more about some of the drivers towards the Taseer assassination a little bit in the report. So I'll refer you to that. I would say in terms of the I would also agree. I don't think we're going to see. I could be proved wrong, but I don't think we're going to see a closure of the NATO supply lines. I think a fair amount of this is posturing. And I think that's been well covered. I would just add on the idea of a creative idea. It might be that I'm just not a creative guy, but I think there's this search for the creative idea, and I think the truth is that if we take not just a realist, but a realistic approach to this, the answer is there is no, I think I completely agree in the IMF. I think looking for inflection points, but ultimately, I think we need to be very realistic about what this looks like, and this looks like creating optimal conditions, for Pakistan to help itself, using coercive mechanisms where possible, using inducements where possible, but ultimately, we can't fix these problems. I think part of the problem, and I'll come to the we in just a moment, is that, if one looks at how aid is given, a lot is given, but a fair amount of that is channeled towards trying to achieve discrete objectives in Afghanistan or vis-a-vis AQ, rather than sort of getting at a lot of these other problems I identified. That's why I identified all these problems, is to say, look, there's all these other issues that need to be addressed. That doesn't mean that the U.S. needs to fix all of them or can fix all of them. What it can do is say, look, when we give aid for these types of issues, we're not going to give aid in terms of what we're good at. All right, what the U.S. is good at doing, because very often that's how we determine the U.S. determines where to give aid up. We're good at doing this, so we'll do it. And it's not necessarily going to be what you ask for because we want you to like us and we want to be friends with you. It's going to be, okay, is Pakistan asking for something that it really needs? And does the U.S. have the requisite, resources and tools to be able to solve that problem? And to me, that is an approach for thinking through how to create some of the conditions for change. Now, in terms of the we, I'll sort of be in loyal opposition. I actually think that there's a number of smart people in and out of government who are working on these issues, and I tend to think that the lack of focus shouldn't necessarily equate to a lack of attention, right? If this is going to be a generational issue, and I think this takes at least a generation, then Pakistan out of the limelight for a little while we don't necessarily have the inflection point to be able to force major change, does perchance create space for the two to sort of work out some of these kinks. And I think there are a number of good programs that are going on. I mentioned, capacity building for the parliament. Well, the USAID is working on that already. So that's just one example of many, right, of helping to build and groom staff and build a congressional research service-like institute over in Pakistan so that they can build their intellectual capacity. That's going to take a lot of time, but that's the type of small-bore investment we don't necessarily hear about, and it's not as glitzy as, we built this big thing, but it can have an impact over time.
Just to add a couple thoughts, especially on that no pushback issue. So I think it is a big thing, and of course the obvious answer, I think one is the fear that you push back, you often end up dead. But I also think, though, that some of the policies we're just discussing here, it's a complex issue, but the more use of coercion, the more we legitimize some of the more extremist groups in Pakistan, and the more we try to love the moderates, those who Twitter in the liberal elites, the more we've ended up, I think, delegitimizing them, because that moderate voice, unfortunately, I think too often gets associated with Western agendas or Western-funded NGOs. And I think that's one of the real tragedies, that the space for moderate voices, I think, in Pakistan has disappeared, often because it becomes delegitimized because it's associated with a pro-West agenda. So I think that's one of the issues. But in terms of what could lead things to change. I mean, I'm skeptical that more coercion would work right now. For one, I think it's in a pretty fragile environment with an economy on the edge in a country of 180 million, which is suffering from sharp increases in instability. Whether more coercion might push them over the edge rather than get them to adopt the policies we want, I think would be a high-risk strategy. But whether over time the political dynamics internally will change, that when you had instability and terrorist violence, when they're being used for proxies in Kashmir or Afghanistan, there could be support for that, especially following the U.S., with the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. I think for many in Pakistan that was popular. When it was contained in the federally administered tribal areas, who cares? But as it's spread into the heartland, I think it is becoming more of a political issue, and in particular, the sharp increase in sectarian violence, which is what I think most Pakistanis, certainly I know, that really hate, and especially the atrocities, by groups like Lashkar-e-Janvi and places like Quetta in particular, but also in Karachi. That's very unpopular, and I think even within the armed forces, you have a significant percentage of Shias who must be disturbed by these developments. In the last elections, the political violence around the elections and the extremist violence related to elections, I think we hadn't seen that level. We've seen very violent elections in the past, but not that form of it. And so I wonder whether the political will dynamic will change, where the cost of doing nothing actually grows when security becomes a bigger concern for many Pakistanis, and that more and more pressure could grow on the Pakistani government, for example, to use the police not first and foremost to protect their narrow political interests, but maybe actually to perform more law and order tasks, because you get bigger political, or pay a higher political cost by not addressing the law and order situation than you might get. So I guess this may be grasping at straws, but I would like to hope that maybe the political cost of doing nothing domestically might increase, and that could change. But I think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions and one last round in the panel. So, Marvin?
It's been a matter of faith. Marvin, why don't you It's been a matter of faith for a long time now, or for at least certainly since 2008, that we want to empower the civilian elected government. Does events like this now perhaps ask us to rethink that? If we see how an elected government reacts in a situation like this, are we perhaps, in pursuing with some effort here to put pressure, are we perhaps not creating a wedge between the TTP and the civilian government, but perhaps opening a wedge now between the civilian government and the military? Because what we have recognized here is that the military is not on the same page as the civilian government. So may we end up here, really, for our own needs here, having to go back to the military to really see our objectives realized.
I have an observation, and maybe I can form it into a question before I'm done talking. It seems to me that we're dealing with a testosterone-driven problem. We have a testosterone-driven set of analyses. Every question that's been asked so far has been from a male. We're looking at domestic barriers. Nothing has ever been said here about females and any potential role for them. I'm just curious. It seems to me that there's got to be a role for somebody other than a male in finding a solution or a set of solutions for the problems for Pakistan.
Well, not.
I am Taira Noor. I am from Pakistan. I am a Fulbright fellow here at the University of Maryland. I have a question from Stephen. When you talk about dismantling barriers to dismantle militancy in Pakistan, don't you think you are overlooking the role of Saudi Arabia in Pakistan in spreading and kind of funding as a breeding grounds? We are talking about dealing with bad guys what US can do, what Pakistani government can do, what political parties can do. But we are not talking about how we are not turning them into bad guys, how we can stop them from becoming a bad guys. Thank you.
One last question in the back. We'll go back to
Thank you. Thank you so much. I also have to say that my name is Omar Samad, I'm a former Afghan diplomat, that I'm also new to Twitter, and I've been amazed to see how effectively and widespread it's being used by the Taliban and some of their spokespeople. So it's not, I don't think it's just a liberal trend or liberal practice. But coming from that region and from Afghanistan especially, it's interesting for me to hear, at least especially the two first speakers, say that give a framework where as though Pakistan is in a defensive mode, that it's under attack from all sides, that it has no other option but to use these elements for its own survival and defense. The view from at least my country is that for at least 40 years or so, Pakistan has had an offensive strategy in the region. And maybe to some Americans it looks defensive. If you ask an average Pashtun in the tribal areas, they're very disgruntled. I mean, they are bearing the brunt of everything that falls from the sky and from land. Pashtun tribal society is about to be decimated at the hands of all types of people. If you look at Afghanistan over the last 40 years, aside from the anti-Soviet period, a lot of problems come from sanctuaries and bases across the border and continue to. Your own soldiers, your own forces have had to deal with this for the past 12 years. But you make it sound as though everybody else has to do everything possible to fix this, and that they are in a defensive mode. And I don't think that's the view really across the region, whether you go to Central Asia, now that USIP is dealing with Central Asia, or to maybe Iran. India, of course, is a different story. I don't want to get into that. And if you hear Pakistanis express themselves freely nowadays, as you said, and it's a good thing that they are expressing themselves freely, they point to this problem as this problem of Pakistan wanting to, I don't want to use the word expand, but having this notion of a grand Islamic state of some sort within certain sectors in the Pakistani military, especially, that this is where the problem lies and that we need to stop this. So what can the United States, not just the United States, but what can others also do? I mean, China, for example, can play a role in all of this, because now we can hear that cars are blowing up in front of Tiananmen Square. And so a lot of things are happening, but what can not just the US, but others also do in order to realize that we all need to help Pakistan? And what is the best way of helping it, aside from saying that they are in defensive mode?
Okay, thank you. Why don't we again give the final word to Stephen. Dan, concluding remarks, answer any of those questions, and then we'll end with you, Stephen.
Great, thank you. Let me start, Andrew, with some of your comments, because I think that they were smart and worth thinking about. And I think part of the logic here is that perhaps if Pakistan is left to a kind of a more of an economic logic, that is, that there will be a demand-driven exercise in providing security from the people of Pakistan, not least because they will recognize that insecurity hurts the economy, and that any leader who's wise enough to want to keep his power will have to accommodate that, and that will lead them to a kind of a smarter internal security strategy. And I hope that's right. But I'm afraid, and some of what I tried to provide in my opening remarks leads me to the more negative conclusion. Some people have used this analogy of the boiling frog, right? That Pakistan is incrementally getting hotter like the frog and doesn't realize that soon it's going to boil. It doesn't recognize the heat that it's actually feeling. It's not smart enough to jump out of the pot. And I'm afraid that the trajectory of the country right now looks more like that to me than it looks like this economically driven demand for smart security precautions. I'm also
I did
afraid,
refer to it as the grasping at straws theory.
okay,
so-
right. I'm also afraid that the trajectory of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship is such that others have, Tom's talked about, it's being sapped of energy, and the degree of skepticism and, frankly, anger here about Pakistan is driving us more and more to a place where it will be harder and harder to envision that kind of more positive cooperation over the long run. So, Stephen, your arguments about incremental approaches and seeing this as a generational problem, I couldn't agree more. It's just if we're steadily sliding downward rather than making gradual incremental progress, then a slower and more deliberate approach actually takes us nowhere good. And that's why I'd like to try to seize some of these perhaps points of inflection or of opportunity. Harlan, I didn't get a chance to answer your question about who would do this, and I think it's a great question. And I think that is the fact that there is less of a heavy hitter, central force in the American political system right now. And Ambassador Holbrooke, for all his warts, but somebody who's got a lot of heft behind him or her to push an agenda with Pakistan leads us to be even that much more skeptical about our ability to take advantage of opportunities or push more ambitious agendas. And I'll go back to what Andrew opened with, the observation that his center is increasingly one of South Asia, not of AFPAC. This suggests a need for a bureaucratic shift. That same bureaucratic shift or something similar needs to be made inside the U.S. government in ways that would prioritize a Pakistan alone approach and a separate Afghanistan approach, but not necessarily link them together in quite the way that we have, and maybe give that Pakistan face, would be somebody, so Ambassador Dobbins right now would be sort of the obvious person, but I think he's really wrapped up in the sort of Afghan endgame issues and doesn't have the ability to do all of the above. So maybe a bureaucratic shift there would be helpful. Yes, Marvin, we're maybe seeing a greater wedge being driven between the military and the civilians, and this is problematic. What I would hope is that, and observe, is that Nawaz Sharif, while he has his deep problems with the military and has his deep problems with us, at the end of the day, he needs to, for his own survival and the survival of his political party and of the economic agenda that he would hope to advance for the country, if in fact he does, he has to wake up to the reality that if forced to choose between a fate with the TTP and sort of being lumped in with the extremists of his country, or being lumped in with the military, which is his original origin anyway, he's going to go back to the military. And if we can push him back in that direction to avoid the kind of fragmentation between the civilian leadership and the military leadership at this juncture, I think that would be a small step in the right direction. I mean, there are lots of other problems as well, but I think that would help us. So I'm somewhat less worried about that, except for it's possible that he won't realize it. And let's hope that's not the case. Just on the testosterone-driven question, look, I could point to a number of prominent Pakistani women who have been very militant in their outlook, and it's not driven by testosterone, but by an ingrained sense. I mean, Shireen Mazari is somebody, if you're on Twitter, you may wish to follow her to get a sense as to where some of that mentality is, and it can be among women as well. But there's a broader reality here, which is, walk the streets of Pakistan and you'll see men, largely, by and large, out in the city, and you go to the offices of political power, and you'll by and large see men occupying those positions. This is a male-dominated political system, and of the many deep problems that we've identified so far, this is maybe one of them, but it's also falls in the generational category that if we set about to try to change that, boy, we're really, I think, tilting at windmills, at least in the near term. I'll leave it there.
Great. Recognize we're running out of time. Just we take a couple of the questions and then kind of summarize here. I mean, Marvin, terrific question, and I think it really feeds into the fact that I don't see this government being off its path right now of trying to empower civilian governance. Okay, we may be less warm to Nawaz than we were to Benazir Bhutto. Keep that name in mind for the question to address the female side in a second. But I mean, I think we're still, trying to move in that direction. So that gets me to the my loyal opposition on the Hakamula question. I mean, it seems to me you got one of three theories right now of how this drone strike went down. Either first, you got that our agency just basically gave a diktat to the ISI and to the civilian government of Pakistan, and we just went ahead and did this because we wanted to get Hakimullah, because he was pictured with the guy who struck our military CIA operation base in 2009. The second one is that, because the Pakistan military suffered a 2-star loss that was claimed by the Hakimullah group a couple months ago, that now there was a modus vivendi between our agency and the ISI, to finally go hard and look hard and give us some authorities to go very close to Haqqani camps, which it looks to me like is kind of where we got him, all right? Very close to places where we haven't been able to strike for a long, long time because of the military intervention. And that somehow that was, we would do that within 48 hours of Nawaz being here to make him look impotent and to split him off from the government. I don't buy either of those two. I think Nawaz came here knowing fully, that there were some things that needed to get done, knowing fully that he was going to pitch the pitch about, sovereignty violations, et cetera, because he doesn't want to cross the military. But then just conveniently, we get this release about how few civilians have been killed by drones in Pakistan, which, by the way, I believe is at least 100 under a realistic estimate, but still, hundreds under the international community's estimates. And then he goes back 48 hours later, and we conduct this strike. Even after, while he's been here, he has somehow had documents that have shown that the previous civilian government was in cahoots with starting this policy, and he's now just trying to stop it. I mean, you can figure out our items from here. I don't think we're in the process of doing a strike against this individual, though, to make Nawaz look bad. I think Nawaz is in a position where he's got to move slowly but cautiously, where he needs to have other options at hand, and I think our government is still trying to help that process. So I offer you that as a counter. Now, I mean, the question about role of females, I mean, just to add to the commentary, Benazir Bhutto, been at the helm of a lot of different things, had a lot of role and voice in Pakistan's decision to go towards nuclear weapons in order to continue development of Lashkar-e-Taiba. I mean, there's a history of women in senior leadership positions in Pakistan who've had the opportunities to go in another direction but haven't. And I just comment, I do a lot of work with the nuclear communities there, and I'm always struck in Pakistan by the number of highly educated, well-spoken, terrific women who work within their nuclear programs. I mean, it's fantastic, it's terrific, and they're in policy advisement positions as well. But I don't see them deviate from the narrative to the final question about this threat in the region, okay? A lot of well-educated, people in Pakistan really do believe that they are under threat and under siege. And that brings me to the ending point comment here, is where I think what Stephen's piece offers you is, if you've studied and spent time looking at, the reasons for the militancy challenge in Pakistan, the reasons many in Pakistan believe rightfully that from their birth they have needed a militant option in order to stand up against Indian aggression and Indian expansionism, and that they can't give that up without risking the states being dismembered, then Stephen adds to that and says, now look at the framework inside the society, the strategic, the political, and the structural, that makes it even harder to dismantle that process, and then look as guys with policy options outside of saying how much time it's going to take. And that's what brings somebody like me to saying that there really are no, epistemological moments where we're going to change Pakistan's view right now. It is going to have to come over time. But if we're going to make progress, that can't come by telling Pakistan how to change its internals. It can by consistently showing them that we're willing to engage with them, but we also want to push them to recognize where their future is. And in South Asia, that future is part of a network of trade and transit with India, not as part of a standalone independent state hoping on fumes to be able to find people outside to keep it propped up while it continues to, boil in the hottest and hotter water.
Great. I'll try to be quick. Okay. First, Ambassador, I completely take your point. Just to clarify, I didn't say that I didn't say that Pakistan was surrounded and by all sides, and that was suffering all of this because of outside entities and was incredibly weak. What I said was that I was talking about their perceptions of their place when I was talking about some of those drivers of their strategic calculus, and that perception is in their mind their reality. I would also just say, and I don't think I'm the first person to say this. If you talk to somebody in like ISIS, they'll probably tell you things are going gangbusters, right? We're doing great because of what they've got going on next door. If you talk to somebody in ISICT, they'll probably give you a very different vantage point in terms of where things look for Pakistan. Law enforcement, IB, et cetera. So I think in that regard, in terms of how Pakistanis perceive their own situation, a lot of where they stand depends on where they sit, in which office, and things of that nature. I would, on women, I mean, enough militant women have been mentioned. I will just simply add, I'm one who, I try to be realistic about, I guess, what I believe the limits of our power are, and I think that changing sort of, the way in which gender roles are handled in Pakistan is beyond the limits of our power. I think it's absolutely, I don't question the importance. I think it's certainly the case that we've seen through research the benefits of more educated women in society, but that's not an area where I think we're going to get a ton of traction. In terms of Saudi Arabia, I think you were probably referring to the money that was coming in. I think the money's a problem, but I also think it's relatively well accepted that the majority of the money that is raised by a lot of the militant groups that operate in Pakistan comes from within Pakistan. And the textbooks that exist, and the mudaris that, well, no. Actually, I'm telling you that a lot of the money that is raised by groups in Pakistan comes from inside Pakistan. You can nod your head, but a lot of money that's raised in Pakistan comes from inside Pakistan. And so while I favor cutting off the tap from Saudi Arabia, I don't think that's going to solve the problem. I think that would be great, and I think that's something that we talk with our Saudi interlocutors about. The U.S. I know does, but that's where I'd come down on that. I want to sort of just finish up on the cost benefit of empowering the civilian government and what we're seeing. I'm not sure. Of Tom's three theories, whether or not Nawaz Sharif was aware, I do think that a lot of what we're seeing right now is probably posturing. And I think, as I've said, we've seen the civilian leaders be far too keen to sort of, dally with anti-state militants, but they've also been not nearly as close to groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Haqqani network as is the military establishment. So it's an interesting disconnect, right? We want to cozy up to the military in terms of the groups that are a problem for Pakistan's internal stability, but we want to be close to the civilians for the groups that are projecting power externally. And ultimately, I think, if you take the long view, encouraging, intellectual, civilian intellectual capacity, and the economic engagement that Tom speaks about and those other issues, begins to potential. I don't want to be overly optimistic, but I would take that over, getting back too close with a military that is supporting these actors externally. And I would then, I guess, close on sort of the demand-driven piece and the state of the relationship. Although I would make one comment, which I think, and this is, take it for what it's worth. You had mentioned sort of the moderates in Pakistan, and I think it took me a while to sort of reconcile with this. And I think one of the things we need to recognize is that those people that we're engaging with are not moderates. They are seen as an extreme in Pakistan as well. They're just not the extreme that we're concerned about, right? The people that I'm going to have, hang out with when I go to Pakistan are, for the most part, those people are not always going to be seen as sort of moderate in society. And I think that goes to the wider question of the relationship. I would like to think that it was demand-driven, but I actually, from if you look at the data, the worse the security situation gets in Pakistan, the more Pakistan holds more closely to those groups that that are considered on side, right? We thought that as the violence went up, that Pakistan would be prepared to make a change, but we haven't seen that, and it's actually the counterfactual to that. Which is why, to me, the only, the only realistic pathway forward is a very sort of slow attempt to stay the course, plotting, and if an inflection point presents itself, try to leverage it approach. I know that's been said for a long time. I'm not actually recommending nation building or spending a ton of cash or anything like that. I'm looking for a much more sustainable, longer-term strategy. And I take the point that nobody's got this portfolio right now, and that there's the danger of drift. And that's why, you know, one of the other things that I write about in the report is I think we need to be realistic about what we can and can't accomplish in Pakistan, and we need to be planning accordingly. But I also think we need to keep in mind that whereas we can potentially try to leverage those inflection points, aid and spending decisions that gets set at the beginning of a fiscal year very often, right? And we can turn off and turn on the tap for like coalition support funds and things like that. But our spending decisions in terms of where that money goes and what our priorities are, I mean, those we have some control over. And I think, you know, because we can't sort of turn on a dime, we need to go back and look at what are the real sort of impediments to the militant infrastructure domestically there that we can control, not from a leverage perspective, and be smarter about how we engage and what we support in that regard. And that's part of what I'm trying to get at here is as we go to 2014 and we rethink what should our CT architecture look like, what should our security sector, you know, reform strategy look like, let's be cognizant of the fact that this is not just about leverage. This isn't just about changing minds. To change that behavior, I think there are a lot of preconditions that are going to have to be met. And I think until those preconditions are met, actually the more violence goes up, the more Pakistan is likely to just sort of hold more closely to some of those actors that we'd like to see them part with. So anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Clearly, we could have gone on a lot longer. I apologize for having gone over, but I think, again, it's an important topic, lots to discuss. We should have scheduled several hours for this one. But thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking our panelists.